After serving 14 years in office, Venezuelan President Hugo Chávez died today following a 2-year battle with cancer. Venezuelan Vice President Nicolas Maduro, who had denied rumors of the leader's death in recent days, made the official announcement on Tuesday that Chavez's had indeed passed. But far from closing a chapter on the country's troubled history, Chavez's death brings with it a number of questions about the Venezuela that we'll see moving forward. So joining us now to discuss, we've got Dan Rosenheck, Online Americans editor for The Economist, Robert Valencia, writer at Global Voices and research fellow at the Council on Hemispheric Affairs, and Anna Benedetti, HuffPost Latino Voices associate editor. So hello to all of you. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Like I said, a lot of questions now obviously raised after Hugo Chávez's death, but let's just start with first things first when it comes to what the leadership will be next. According to the Constitution, although there are some people that are interpreting it in different ways, they have 30 days for another election, but the vice president will be taking over in the interim. Dan, how do you really see this playing out? I mean, clearly there is an opposition. They did lose in the last election, but what do you think that we can expect to happen next?
Well, the first question is whether the election will indeed be held within the 30-day window as required by the Constitution. There's clearly a lot of logistics that go into organizing this, and in a government that has been so led from the top down for all these years, getting this vote held on time will be, I think, a challenge to start with. Then, as far as whatever happens and who the next president of Venezuela will be, it's completely, I think, anybody's guess, because in the last campaign, all the polls showed that although Capriles wound up losing to Chavez by 10 points or 11, he had very big margins over everybody else within Chavismo, within the pro-government movement. So that would suggest that against Maduro, Capriles would win handily. On the other hand, Chavez enjoyed a very big advantage, which was his ability to deploy all the resources of the state in favor of his campaign. And presumably, to a certain extent, Maduro, if he is indeed the government's candidate, will benefit from the same as well, and that should narrow the gap at least somewhat between him and Capriles. So I think it's really an open question. I think if I had to bet, I'd probably bet on Capriles, but I wouldn't wager too much money on it.
And so clearly there are, individuals and names there that we can talk about. But Anna, I know that you spent some time in Venezuela recently too, and just talk about the way that Chavez really is seen as a political figure and as a leader there amongst the people. I mean, already you have reports from the Associated Press of Venezuelans pouring into the streets to mourn Hugo Chavez. This was a very personality-centric type of political structure in this country, and so if you want to talk about this socialist-style revolution really living on in Venezuela, can that be done when you've had somebody that was such a strong figurehead like Hugo Chavez? Can it be done without him?
I think it depends on how you define continuing. I think that there's one aspect which is the model of using Venezuela's enormous oil revenues for some mixture of social spending and promoting the party and the president that happens to be in power. That, I think, will continue. But there was another element layered on top of that, which was Chavez's own magnetic personality and charisma and bond with Venezuela's poor and working class that I think will be very hard for anyone else within Chavismo to replicate.
And Anna, I'd love to hear from you now too. I think Dan probably thought that I said his name before, although I want everyone's opinion.
Actually, I agree with what Dan said, so that was pretty much it. I think actually continuing with Chavismo after Chavez is dead would be pretty hard, because he was the center of this, and I don't know if anyone can actually replicate what he did and who he is. So it is anyone's guess, but I don't see that happening.
Robert, what's your take here?
Well, I think there's one thing that we need that I think we pretty much all agree on, is just that the death of Chavez does not by all means mean that it's the death of Chavismo. I think we have currently that out of 24 states in Venezuela, 20 are ruled by the Chavez cohort. And then the great majority of the General Assembly in Caracas is ruled by the Chavistas at the helm of Diosdado Cabello. I think the big problem here is from the opposition that had a tremendous blow when Chavez won the presidency, even though they had a tremendous rise at with Capriles traveling all over the country. Unfortunately, this represented a demoralizing state for the opposition. Maduro will definitely be at leading the next elections in the next 30 days. But as David has pointed out, there are more questions than answers. But I think Maduro, or worst case scenario, Cabello will be leading the pack again.
And maybe Anna, you can elaborate on for us a little bit too, just on the life that you experienced in Venezuela, and the way that it's really hard, I think, for outsiders to try to put into perspective, because you look at the way that Chavez has been represented, from the West, really as a huge villain, for so many years. But then at the same time, it's a very complicated web, clearly, that he's woven there when it comes to the policies. If you want to talk about, empowering millions of people and, and using a lot of the oil money to really put that into social programs, social spending, at the same time creating a big rift with more of a middle class, and the richer elements of society. Clearly there are human rights abuses and violations. Clearly there is not freedom of the press in a country like this. How would you describe life in Venezuela?
Well, being a journalist in Venezuela, I'd have to say that it's extremely hard, because it is a country where the freedom of the press is, although it's legally guaranteed, that is not the reality of the situation right now. In 2007, one of the major TV stations, RCTV, was their license for transmission was suspended, was not renewed, and they weren't allowed. And 32 radio stations were shut down. So while legally freedom of speech is supposed to be guaranteed, that is not what is happening. 3 TV stations are owned by the government, and it's a very difficult situation in Venezuela right now. It's a country that is extremely divided, and Chavez has caused that division between the people, that just not get along, and violence is overwhelming. It's worse in many cases than war zones. So yes, he has created social programs. I'm not denying that, but I don't know how much that has actually helped the country move ahead.
Robert, looked like you were nodding your head there, like you wanted to jump in.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think Chavez exemplifies what we have seen in Latin American history, the figure of caudillismo, or what we call in English the competitive authoritarian regime, meaning that these charismatic figures use the power of democracy. They rose to power by way of elections, but the ones that are in power, they start changing the constitution. We have to remember that Chavez made 15 referenda to change the constitution in his favor. So what we're saying is, Venezuela and Chavez became an oxymoron. He had the biggest oil reserves in Venezuelan history. Venezuela could have been the most prosperous country in Latin America. And what he did was a complete mismanagement of the coffers of Petróleos de Venezuela, just to subsidize other countries that share the same philosophy of Chavez, like Nicaragua, you have Cuba, then you have even Dominica under Petrocaribe, and then you have all these oil reserves going to Cuba. So part of the revolution is that even though Chavez brought the poverty to the spotlight, it became an oxymoron, because as the journalist from AP just pointed out, there's a big division and social disparity in Venezuela. Yeah,
and again, like I said, I think that people will be obviously talking about Chavez and the legacy that he's left behind, and both being an authoritarian and democratic, and and a very complicated figure to try to dissect in one way. One of the questions, though, that I think is on everyone's mind, especially if you want to talk about foreign officials, is what does this mean for the oil? And so, Dan, I'm curious what you say there. I mean, Venezuela is one of the top oil producers in the world. They're the 4th largest oil supplier to the United States alone. And you already have a lot of U.S. political figures weighing in on this. President Obama saying that he hopes that this opens up a new chapter in relations. A lot of people have some not so nice words that they have reserved for Hugo Chávez in his passing. Where do you think that we can, expect this to go?
Well, but there's the oil markets, and then there's foreign policy more broadly. On the oil markets, for all Chavez's rhetoric and threats about choking off oil and whatnot, he has sold every barrel he can at the market price, and I don't think there's any reason to suspect that his successors, regardless of party, will do anything different. In the sort of medium term, I think we could hope that if you see a different administration or a different style of regime in Venezuela, you might see the state oil company PDVSA hopefully become a bit more professional, get rid of some of the patronage jobs, get in more technical experts, and try to get production, which has fallen substantially during Chavez's government, back up to the levels it was beforehand. And obviously an increase in Venezuelan production would, all other things equal, lead to a decrease in world prices. But I think even if that happens, the effect would be sort of marginal. On foreign policy, Chavez was the leader inherited from Fidel Castro, the role of the leader of the anti-American bloc in Latin America. I think this leaves a huge void in that regard. I don't think Raúl Castro or whoever succeeds him in Cuba will fill it. I think that Rafael Correa in Ecuador is trying to fill it, but that is a fairly small country and somebody who doesn't nearly have Chavez's sort of international reach. So I think that the quote-unquote anti-imperialist bloc is going to be a little bit rudderless or leaderless for a while, and I think on net that's probably a benefit above all to the more moderate social democratic left-leaning regimes in Latin America, such as Dilma Rousseff in Brazil, or the Broad Front in Uruguay, or Mauricio Funes in El Salvador. And I guess from the economist perspective, we probably think that's a good thing.
And so, but while, as you call it, this anti-American bloc may be dissipating in terms of, in terms of its fervor, how would we even look at some of the news stories and what happened today, where we also saw U.S. Officials be kicked out of the country, right, for supposedly trying to plot something. And so, I mean, if we just take that as a sign of the direction in which things are going, with Nicolas Maduro, at least in the meantime, Anna, what would you say?
Well, Venezuela right now is headed into some troubled waters either way. The economy, right, the inflation rates are through the roof, and this was happening with or without Chavez. This is something that was being, that people were forecasting, and so I think that with Chavez's death and with the elections coming up, it's just it just gets more tense and more complicated. It's hard to say exactly what direction it's going to go, but I think right now it's just still not good.
Robert, what would you say if we had to use today's events as as just a way to try to figure out how to navigate through the waters?
Well, for if you want to pose as a hero, you need to have a villain, and the United States is the perfect scapegoat. I mean, if you hear today's news, Nicolas Maduro said that the United States inflicted cancer on Chavez. Of course, there's no true account of that. I think it's always this love-hate relationship between Venezuela and the United States. But truth to be told, the United States is one of the main trade partners of Venezuela. We have Citgo. Citgo is the largest oil company in the United States, and it's owned by PDVSA. So, and the United States actually buys most of the oil to Venezuela. So there's always this love-hate relationship. And I think this is a time where John Kerry, as a Secretary of State, probably should reach out to Nicolas Maduro in these trying times for Venezuelans, or for the Venezuelan government for that matter, and to really build up a diplomatic corps that is truly knowledgeable of what's going on in Venezuela, and not just Venezuela, but in Latin America. This is, as David was pointing out, is the left trend in Latin America, be it moderate or the left or the radical left, is a sign of the declining influence of the United States in the region. And I think could be a good opportunity for the Obama administration to really assemble a team of diplomats who can travel to Venezuela and really know what's going on in the country.
And especially with an administration and really, a country that as a whole we've been so wrapped up with focusing on the Middle East, pivoting to Southeast Asia in particular these days when you want to talk about militarily what's going on. And, I think that it's fair to say that in terms of Latin America and the diplomacy in that region, some of that has been left behind and not really, put to the forefront by this administration. But now John Kerry definitely has a tough job ahead of him. I want to thank you all so much for joining. Like I said, this is something that we'll all be watching and still continuing to discuss in the days and the weeks and even more to come. So Dan, Robert, and Anna, thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, guys, stick around. We got some trendy stories coming up next.